the Japanese culture without knowing the Chinese and Korean roots behind it, and no East Asian specialist would dream of doing that. That you have to see the cultures as interrelated, and that the older cultures and the more elaborate cultures had the predominant cultural influence. One of our basic disagreements is that Mary Lefkowitz, sitting in the 20th century, feels that she knows better than the Greek historians of the 5th and 4th, 3rd century, when they said that there were significant influences. Yes, he was very impressed. Yes, he was very Greek. But what struck him were specific similarities, and Herodotus, a rather plodding historian, he said, well, what's the reason for these similarities? I think they're too close for coincidence. I don't think the Egyptians could have borrowed them from the Greeks because they've had them so long. Therefore, the most likely explanation is that the Greeks took them from the Egyptians. And this is what I call the ancient model. And this model was not overthrown until the early 19th century. Now, Mary Lefkowitz mentions the 18th century novels, and at times, despite the attention she's devoted to dismissing my book, I sometimes feel she hasn't read it, because I do devote quite a few pages to the novel Setos, which she talks, and I too have read it. It had to be sent by interlibrary loan to me, and I do think it is important in the formation of Masonic thought. But what she does not bring forward is the fact that this was perfectly orthodox history as understood in the 18th century, and going back beyond the 18th century to the view that the Greeks and Romans had of the Egyptian sources of their own culture. Now, I think that the Greeks were, on the whole, a very intelligent people, and I respect their philosophy, their art, their democracy, their science, but I also respect their history, and this is a great anomaly in Mary Lefkowitz's approach, in that she says they're very good in these other respects, but they cannot be trusted with their own history. So that I want to bring that out, that one has... Now, she says that modern classics has dismissed all this, and it's true that the predominant view of modern classicists is that the debts to Egypt and Phoenicia, and I don't want to underestimate the importance of Levantine or Southwest Asian influences on Greece, that these influences were exaggerated by the Greeks, and I think that they clearly were I think they were properly developed, and to some extent the Greeks may even have played down because they were very conscious of being Greek and proud as being Greeks, and they were affected by two forces. On the one hand, they wanted to plug in to the ancient civilizations and give themselves cultural depth. On the other hand, they were very conscious of being Greeks and wanted not to be surpassed culturally by the Egyptians and Phoenicians, who were still very much around. So they had two forces working on them. Modern scholars working in an intensely racist 19th and 20th century had no double force. They had the single force wanting to make Greece pure, white and European, and the ideological pressure that put on the scholars led to what I see as the recent dismissal of Egyptian and Phoenician influences on ancient Greece.
Thank you.
Okay, so what he's saying here is the Greeks wanted it to appear very Greek flavoured, and as if it were their own. Okay, we remember reading that or hearing that somewhere else, probably through Shaka Omos in his debate with Dr. Ali Muhammad on ancient Kemet and the Greeks, Ptolemy, etc. Okay, so now we're going to jump to this man here, Dr. Guy M. MacLean Rogers, to see what he has to say.
Thanks. Preliminary answers to the questions that the contributors to our volume found. Obviously, among the important questions that people have been concerned with, number one, were the ancient Egyptians black? Two, Did the ancient Egyptians or the Hyksos colonize Greece? Did the ancient Egyptians or the Phoenicians massively influence the early Greeks in the areas of language, religion, science, or philosophy? 4. Did 18th and 19th century scholars obscure the Afro-Asiatic roots of classical civilization for reasons of racism and anti-Semitism? Let me give you some sense of our conclusions. Number 1, the scholars who have looked carefully at the first question have concluded that the attempt to fit the ancient Egyptians into a modernizing category of either black or white do so from a perspective which lacks both historical and biological justification. Did the ancient Egyptians or the Hyksos colonize what would later become Greek lands in the second millennium? Unambiguous archaeological evidence to that effect is lacking in the Mediterranean. Did the ancient Egyptians and the Phoenicians massively influence the Greeks in the areas that I outlined? There is no doubt, and no one has denied for at least 50 years that I know of, that there was Egyptian influence on early Greek culture in several different areas. In areas, actually, that curiously Professor Bernal skips over, like art and architecture. The real scholarly question is, can that influence be described as massive in the sense that Professor Bernal means? And the conclusion which scholars from many different subdisciplines, and not just classicists, but Egyptologists, Semiticists, and African historians have reached, is that the case cannot be made for a massive influence. Furthermore, students of the ancient world propose a very different model of interaction among the cultures of the ancient world in the time period that we're discussing. Instead of seeing a one-way street leading from Egypt to Greece, scholars now are shaping a model which includes many two-lane highways going from Egypt to Greece, going from Egypt to the Near East to West Asia, and back in the other direction as well. What about racism and anti-Semitism in 18th and 19th century historiography? Yes, there were some scholars who operated from a framework which we would consider to be both racist and anti-Semitic, but an undifferentiated picture of racism and anti-Semitism cannot be sustained on the basis of the evidence.
Well, we've heard the conclusions, and we'll get to the amplification of the conclusions as we go on into the evening. But I wanted first to ask each of the discussants tonight how they came to this particular area of study, and how scholastically have they undertaken comparative analysis in this particular area of study. How, in effect, are you preparing them, or have you prepared yourself? We'll start at this end of the table and go straight there. Yes?
I'm not sure I quite understand you're asking. Are you asking how or what our scholarly preparation was? Both. Okay.
As much as you exert influence,
yes,
by virtue of your scholarship in this area, I'm asking, how do you defend your scholarship in this area? How did you acquire your scholarship in this area?
Okay. In a way.
And find out what his answer was, and then Mary Lefkowitz's answer, retort to that, etc., etc. When you watch this video, see, it's very, very long. It's like 2 hours and 55 minutes long, almost 3 hours. I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on it. We just suggest it's best that you watch it for yourself and come to your own understanding, your perspective, your opinions, etc. Summing it up, we are going to quote Dr. John Henrik Clarke, who comes in later, towards or further on. He's left out for a while, but then he's asked for a response to a certain subject, etc., topic. And he basically suggests, because he's read, and this is where he's learned from, okay, also, he's read the book by George G.M. Jones, Stolen Legacy, and he talks about top Egyptologists, John Baines, David O'Connor, Frank Urco, Martin Bernal. His basic facts are, he talks about H.G. Wells' Outline of History, which we have. We'll do a video on that, or we may have already done a video on that. Could put it as an end screen. He states that H.G. Wells, even though not a historian, more renowned or known for his science fiction works like, was it War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, etc. We have had people comment a year or so ago, he was just a sci-fi writer, he's not a historian, all this sort of stuff. But they obviously haven't studied him enough to realise that he was, in a sense, a historian. And also because his basic facts, according to Dr. John Henrik Clarke, his basic facts, i.e. to do with the Crusades, are in order, very accurate, yet very Eurocentric, to the point of prejudice, or if you listen to this video, he may say racist. Not that he's not indicating that H.G. Wells was racist, but yeah, pointing to prejudice, we would rather say that. Okay, check out the video to find out exactly what he said. Okay, hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. He recommends Gerald Massey's Book of Beginnings, Volume 1, Volume 2, which we've done a video on, because there's mention of the New Zealand indigenous Maori people's language, Te Reo, being very similar to the Akkadian Hebrew and more closer to the Egyptian, the ancient Kemet language. Okay, I don't know if many of these Kemet House of Consciousness Kemet followers have actually read both of those volumes and picked up on that we may be, us Maori, New Zealand Maori, may be more Egyptian than they are, or just as Egyptian they are. Okay, and he talks about Booker T. Washington, who was very favoured by the Europeans or white culture at that particular time. John Jackson, Charles Cypher, J. Rogers, 6 volumes, Egypt, Natural Light of the World, Natural Genesis. There's several volumes here, maybe 2 to 6 volumes, by Gerald Massey. So he also suggests, or he was suggested by Arthur Schoenberg, who did an essay, The Negro Digs Up His Past, okay, who was very influential to Dr. Henrik Clarke when he was younger, made some very valid suggestions and said that, you know, if he studied his history, he might become like the next Booker T, very famous orator, historian, etc., in his older days, which he actually did. Okay, we're going from our notes here. So yeah, he said basically to Dr. John Henrik Clarke, go study the history of the masters, the oppressors who took you out of history. Okay? He took the African history out of history. So you'll understand your history, your African history, which Dr. Henrik Clarke actually did. He studied all those writings, those books, etc. Bradley's The Iceman Inheritance, the Odyssey and Iliad of Homer, orally composed until around the 6th century BC in Athens, Greece. Okay. So he suggests look at all of those to discover the truth about African history. If you're of African origin, African American, etc., it's very important. Okay, this man, Dr. Henrik John Clarke, as well as Dr. Ben Yochanan, was well respected by these ancient Kemet, these modern Kemet followers today, like Shaka Amos, especially, etc. He holds them in high esteem because he's actually met them, one or both of them, and listened to what they had to say, and he taught them very, very well, and they highly respect him, etc., etc. Not just because he is of Afro-American descent or African, etc., but he to them established the facts, provided the evidence of their long lost, suppressed African history. So again, go study the history of the masters, the oppressors who took the African out of African history, or took African history, left it out, okay, in everyday history. So I'll understand your African history as Dr. John Henrik Clarke did. Okay. And if you like this video, because we're going to end it there, please subscribe to our channel, add your comments below, give us a thumbs up, and then go share this with all your family, friends, neighbours, and so forth, and tell them about us, the Ministry of the Real Truth, who strive to bring you the real truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the real truth, according to the established facts, the evidence that's proved itself evident, the irrefutable and the infallible.